So in part one, the authors do focus on what matters rather than what works. I think Gert Biester and also Professor Alan Reid from South Australia would agree with this principle as well, is that the best systems, the best schools and the best countries even as well, if you looked at, if you're using PISA or some kind of global test like that as your measurement, those countries or those systems or those schools that are most effective are those which actually have a clear vision of what they want and then they can go about achieving it. And in Australia, that's perhaps not as clear what we're after specifically. The final chapter, one of the final chapters about leadership talks about riding two wild horses between NAPLAN and holistic education. I think that's really true of Australia as a whole. We've got the many different forces and many different views on education, and how they all contribute and become one clear goal is really tricky. From this chapter, what really I got a lot out of was the idea of collaboration and teacher choice, and those two things being intertwined, empowering the teachers to make choices and to collaborate. Also involving the community and following along with the public concerns of that area, of that context, is something that I thought was particularly often taken for granted as something a little bit harder to do, to truly engage parents and the broader community in the activities of schools. But that's also true, I think, of the wider nationwide community. We don't really have a clear goal. So if the best schools provided in these examples have that clear goal, then they can set out in engaging parents in the process as well. Personally, I think the inclusion of Indigenous students, special needs, low literacy, all the kind of excluded and left out students, language background other than English as well, is something that's really important for what works as well as what matters. So it matters, and therefore we have to find the best way to make it work. So the influence and the issue around edu-business, I think, is something that I'm becoming increasingly aware of, both in my own practice and in a global, more broader sense as well. So just if you think simply of the fact that all our schools have a learning management system, that is a certain narrowing of our work, and sort of by providing various boxes and various things, affordances and possibilities, it also delimits some things from being able to be done. So if your LMS has a certain expectation of what learning and teaching is, then that will also limit your role as a teacher, because you are making heavy use of those applications or those programs in your teaching. It's also the question of data stewardship. What happens to the students' data? Are you a Google school or a Microsoft school? What does that mean for your students and their ongoing engagement and involvement in the world? And what happens to their data when they become adults or in their process of becoming adult? There's also the question of NAPLAN and sort of the businesses that spring up as a result of that. NAPLAN preparation booklets are everywhere, every bookshop you go into, and there's always the question of how closely tied the people making the NAPLAN are with those producing the similar related tests and so forth. There's your visible learning in your Hattie, who's on the board of AITSL, and that's a bit questionable and a bit touch and go. There's the idea of 21st century learning and the ways that was a conglomerate of commercial edtech companies or just technology companies, and that they're setting in a certain way the agenda of our schools in the ways that they're seeking the ideal worker for their companies, and those become the 6 C's or whatever they are that we're trying to inculcate into our students, is concerning and something I think we need to be keeping on top of. So in terms of teacher voice, autonomy and sort of self-representation, I think this is a really complicated and fraught issue. So basically, I think the unions have a large role in promoting teacher voice and leading the way in conditions and in actually engaging teachers in the processes that they take part in as sort of the lead bodies in the educational space. There's a certain limitation on social media, but obviously teachers are engaging with one another on social media, and that's very powerful. But it's also sort of not something to be taken as as the be all and end all, but it's very important. There's also the local and the school level is where it gets tricky again. Like I said earlier, parent and community involvement in broader educational issues and even political educational issues is something that's important, but with the time constraints we have, something very difficult. It can also be done face to face, but my broad opinion on teacher self-representation and empowerment is that Teachers need to be given time, which costs money, and they need to be given training, and not so much training in how to be more assertive or anything like that, but just being involved in the process makes people more familiar with the process and therefore better able to engage with it. So, taking a teacher out of a classroom and putting them in a policy level discussion isn't necessarily going to be effective if they haven't been trained and made aware of the things being discussed and how they can actually impact on those things. But obviously that's what we're aiming for, and a lot of that has to do with trust, as will be discussed in the leadership section.